If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description. You are listening to MindShock True Crime. This is the Jonestown series, and today we're going over the origins of Jim Jones. This is, of course, your host, Bruce McGuire.
And Maxwell Powers. And JR.
And once again, if you like the podcast, feel free to donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you're subscribed to the MindShock channel. Hit the bell for notifications. And if you like the video, feel free to share it across social media. And make sure to like our Facebook page and check us out on Twitter, Reddit, and Patreon as well. Okay, so this is the origin episode of Jim Jones, the strangely, bizarrely charismatic figure that was able to capture the hearts and minds of many, many followers. That they actually followed him all the way to Guyana in South America. How many cult leaders do you think had this kind of a following where they can get almost 1,000 people to move this kind of distance? I mean, there have been some cults in the past. I mean, Heaven's Gate, some of the other ones. But how many of them would be willing to move that far into some kind of humid jungle with unknown conditions? I mean, I guess once you have them brainwashed severely enough, but wasn't Jonestown like the final stage of the brainwashing?
Bruce, that's an interesting question. I would say that it's not necessarily the final step in the brainwashing. I'd say to most of the American public and most of the viewers at large, it's the final stage. I mean, to be honest, Bruce, like a lot of this started in Redwood Valley. So, I mean, the commune living of the Jonestown or the People's Temple movement, a socialist movement, began in Redwood Valley. However, I will say that it's almost as if there were different phases. For example, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were forced to move to the ghettos. That could be considered Redwood Valley. Jonestown would be considered the final solution. So, yes, you're right and you're wrong at the same time.
All right, so let's go through the history of Jim Jones's life and what culminated into him basing this compound in Jonestown. And what we went over was basically murder.
Yes, well, it wasn't basically, it was murder. I mean,
Yeah.
There were several suicides that did take place in Jonestown that day. However, the bulk of the 1,000 people, and keep in mind, we've thrown around in previous podcasts the 1,000 figure. There were actually 900 and something, and I believe it was 928 people that were accounted for. According to records, there were over 1,000 people in Jonestown at the time. There's still between 20 and 125 people that are still to this day unaccounted for that supposedly were in Jonestown at the time of the massacre.
Okay, so let's look at the founder of the People's Temple cult. So he began this so-called People's Temple in Indiana in the 1950s. He was officially ordained in 1956 by the Independent Assemblies of God and in 1964 by the Disciples of Christ. And then he moved the temple to California in 65 and gained notoriety in San Francisco in the early 1970s. He then relocated to Guyana. Okay, so let's look at his early life. He was born May 13th, 1931, in a rural area of Crete, Indiana, to James Thurman Jones, a World War I veteran, and Lynetta Putnam. Jones was of Irish and Welsh descent. He later claimed partial Cherokee ancestry through his mother, but his maternal second cousin later stated this was untrue. Do you know anything about that, JR?
Well, if you look at Jones, he actually does have the look that he possibly could have passed as an Indian. However, I do agree with his cousin in that it was untrue. I've studied the bloodline quite extensively, and he was not of Cherokee Indian descent. I mean, I think the Indians have been through enough. They don't need him as their lineage. So I can say that that's patently false. However, I will say a couple of things. First of all, his father, who suffered from, his father was unable to work, mainly because during World War I, he suffered extreme exposure to mustard gas and was decorated. However, his military records have been, I've to this day, I mean, even as someone that has the ability to reach in and touch various government records, they supposedly were part of the 1974 archival fire that occurred in Washington, D.C. So his military records of his father are not able to be reconstructed. However, he was a veteran. He served his country. He was awarded several medals because of that sacrifice. However, he wasn't able to work, and as a result, his mother was responsible as the sole breadwinner. Additionally, Jones said a lot of things about his heritage. I think Jones liked to, I mean, it's almost like the ballpark cram commercial, you know, it plumps when you cook them. Jones's opinion of his own family plumped as he got bigger and bigger and bigger. However, he came from dirt poor poverty, and the fact that he had working water facilities and toilet facilities in his house at his age growing up were considered almost a luxury.
Okay, so to kind of expand on what you just said, yes, he went through economic difficulties during the Great Depression, led the Jones family moving to the town of Lynn in 1934, where Jones grew up in a shack without plumbing, as you just said. As a child, Jones was a voracious reader who studied Stalin, Marx, Mao, Gandhi, and Hitler, carefully noting the strengths and weaknesses of each. That seems like normal things for a little child to do, huh?
Well, I mean, and keep in mind that, like, you know, like a lot of people don't know this, but Hitler was actually his idol growing up as a child. That he was fascinated from a very early age. We're talking about before the age of 15. He was very fascinated with the idea that someone could move an entire country based on their beliefs of one person. So to him, Hitler was actually a very powerful role model, even though that's not really spoken about in any documentaries or anything that you'll read about with Jones. He actually idolized Hitler and Mein Kampf for that.
What do you think about that, Maxwell? Does that lead some explanations to his ideology to a certain extent, or no?
Um, Maybe, but I don't know. Hitler liked to kill other people, not
Well, did he? Hitler never killed anybody himself.
or I don't know.
Well, I mean, really, when you think about it, Maxwell, you know, Jones actually surpassed. I mean, even within the public mind. I mean, maybe Jones was responsible for Jonestown. Maybe he wasn't. But at the end of the day, he was written down in history as that he led his followers to death. Could the same be said about Hitler, who had Mengele and all these other people that were responsible for the actual killings? His hands were effectively clean. I mean, in accordance with history, he just led the doctrine, whereas Jones was actually part of the executional process.
Yeah, it's the parallels aren't exact, definitely not exact. Jones developed an intense interest in religion primarily because he found making friends difficult. Now, how much of that you think is responsible for his interest in being a cult leader? Since he couldn't have it, he didn't have friends, so he had to brainwash people into just following him.
I like that. Yeah,
Are you directing that question to me, Bruce, or?
I think to both of us, but
Yeah, to both of you guys. But hold on a second. Childhood acquaintances later recalled Jones as being a, quote, really weird kid, end quote, who was obsessed with religion and obsessed with death. They alleged that he frequently held funerals for small animals on his parents' property and stabbed a cat to death. So we actually went over this on the previous episodes as well. Jones's fascination with death, and supposedly he actively went out and killed animals just so he could hold funerals.
Yes, and that's actually true.
that's pretty sick.
Yeah, I mean, Jones is noted with killing a cat just so he could hold a funeral. And in fact, I'm not privy to the exact documentary, but there were actually people that were his childhood quote-unquote friends that actually led people out into the forest. And to this day, there are still rock mounds that exist within the forests where Jones actually killed animals just for the fact of killing them and buried them. And those markers still exist to this day.
Yeah, that's dark, but going back to the point about not having friends, Maxwell kind of just laughed at that. But JR, what do you think psychologically Do you think that had, it seems to me, just from a cursory overview of this case, it seemed like that could have actually been the impetus that motivated him to needing to control people since he didn't have anybody to play with.
I think you're right, Bruce. I mean, I think that, even though, according to modern science, we don't develop our conscience by age 7, that's when we develop our, conscience. I believe that the truth is that a lot of our predisposition can be determined earlier than that. I would say that I think it's obvious to an extent that it's not about necessarily friends. It's about he became addicted to the one part of his life that he can control. And in Jones's life, the one thing that he could control were these animals that were helpless and looked up to him, living or dying. And he was able to determine at that particular point which they lived and died. I think that exuded a certain amount of power to him in an otherwise powerless world. I think that should be examined further. I mean, when we talk about Jonestown and we talk about Jim Jones, we always look at the aftermath. We look at the last 4 hours, but we don't look at the actual, what led to that point. I think Jones was addicted to power. It wasn't just the power over controlling people. It was the power over controlling people's lives and their death, and whether or not they were willing participants that led up to that moment. I think that's what made him viable to the government. I think that's what made him viable to his own people, because he was able to go there to places that normal people weren't willing to go to, and he was willing to actually reach in and touch. There's a very famous line that fate is reaching out into nothing and just grabbing hold of just something and waiting for it to manifest. I think there's something to be said about that. Jones was able to reach into the lives of people that otherwise would just be discarded by society and say, hey, you have something, and I want that, and you want that, and we need that, and you're a part of this. And I think that made his movement that much more viable.
Yeah, and let's explore that a little further. Jones and a childhood friend both claim that his father, who was an alcoholic, was associated with the Ku Klux Klan, which had gained a stronghold in Depression-era Indiana. Jones, however, came to sympathize with the country's repressed African American community due to his own experiences as a social outcast. Jones later recounted how he and his father clashed on the issue of race and how he did not speak with his father for many, many years after he refused to allow one of Jones's black friends into the house. After James and Lynetta Jones separated, Jones moved with his mother to Richmond, Indiana. In December 1948, he graduated from Richmond High School early with honors. So let's examine this. So his father was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Has that been corroborated officially or not, JR?
Oh, that has been officially corroborated. And, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Again, I don't know if I stated this before, but a poll of his military records resulted in a not found. That wasn't by me. That was by the people that actually trained me on this particular case. Jones's father's military records actually supposedly were burned up in the 1974 fire within the Washington, D.C., when the archive caught fire. However, his actual Ku Klux Klan membership has been verified by multiple individuals who substantiate the fact that he was an active member in the Ku Klux Klan. Whether or not he held rank, that's up for debate, but he was an active member.
So that archival fire, just as a quick aside, that would be a convenient way for certain documents to get swept under the rug, would it not?
It would be, we're talking about a very deep rabbit hole here, Bruce. The archival fire destroyed the files of approximately 10 to 14 million different people that served in the United States Armed Forces between the early 1900s to 1960. So again, it's not necessarily, Jones's father that brought that whole rhetoric about. However, I know of several individuals that are above my level that have attempted to gain that that knowledge, because I mean there's a big question as to whether he was decorated and to what decoration level. I mean, like, and I mean that goes beyond the scope of just.
Let me introduce a new conspiracy theory here. Is it possible that the CIA was interested in Jim Jones because they were previously aware of his father, and his father was involved in something in the military that got him involved with the agency?
It's possible. We'll never know because of the fire, and that's said not just to the Jonestown conspiracy, but multiple conspiracies that we can touch on additional episodes. That there were people that were of a very high level that either suffered or, I mean, to the very least, you have to understand, for World War I soldiers, Jones's father was not ultimately given the Purple Heart because it was not given at that particular point in time just because, you wounded a knee or you blew your leg off. But he was actually entitled to it based on the retroactive aspect of the Purple Heart contract. Whether or not he actually ever received it, to this day we don't know because his family isn't talking and the archive was supposedly burned. So there are various aspects to how decorated his father was, how intimate his father was with the government. Because, as the government ages, I mean, you have to understand, America is really not that old. I mean, if you look at, England, or you look at, China, their military and their expanse spans over thousands of years. America cannot claim the same credit in that we're not that far along in the pipeline of history. So we don't actually know how decorated or how involved his father was in the United States military.
How is it possible that none of the people he served with had talked, or their children talked, or friends of the family?
And again, that's the question. I mean, we're given the story. This is the official story that Jones's father basically worked. I mean, it's not necessarily stated, but it's stated in so many sentences that he worked as a garbage truck worker for the state of Indiana. He was in World War I and was poisoned so heavily with mustard gas that he became winded very easily. We are not aware of how the medals that he was given, or how heavily he was involved with various missions, aspects, or involved with the government in terms of war. We're just simply told this fairy tale that he's a garbage truck worker that worked in World War I, and that's the end of the line. We're never told how he was decorated, how he was, represented, how he was respected by the United States federal government. So that does leave a hole that to this day is never going to be answered because of the fire. That was the official explanation to my boss. That wasn't even me. That was my boss's boss.
Yeah, but people always know, though. I'm sure people that were around at the time, people know.
But people were retired, Bruce. People have pensions that they have to protect.
But I'm sure there's been memos. Maybe they're classified. If they are classified, there's got to be a reason for that.
Well, if you go to the official website that describes the actual archival fire of 1974, they do say that various aspects of a record can be pieced together for the right price, effectively.
I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about his superiors. So James Thurman Jones, his superiors in World War I, his commanding officers. I'm sure they would have known what exactly he did, whether he received whatever he received, his involvement. There are records other than those in the fire. There would have been people in the know, and I'm sure things have been recorded outside of those particular records.
And like I said, the federal government, I mean, even to your viewers that are not interested in this podcast, but want to know about their loved ones that worked in World War I, there are methods that the archive takes into place, and they can piece together certain pieces. However, that appears to be a blanket excuse for particular individuals, and in this particular individual, there's no record. I mean, there's a record that he served, but there's no record of what occurred.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about how much does his early graduation with honors tell us?
I think I mean, do you want to chime in, Maxwell?
No, it's okay.
Max
Okay.
Alarmy.
All right. So I'll say that there's two things that really point out a very clear-cut picture of Jones early on. One, he was extremely intelligent. And I think, people undermine that because, again, Jones is associated with drinking the Kool-Aid. And anyone that drinks the Kool-Aid's got to be a moron. I think that Jones was of an extraordinary intelligence. It's already been said by his followers, and even people that were not his followers, just political people that wanted to be around him so they could become elected, that there was an extraordinary charisma that surrounded him. I think Jones was he was a genius in the shadows. I mean, and that's going to really piss people off because to know that, Jones was a genius and then he killed people. But, there are good geniuses and there are bad geniuses. I think that this is a really good example of someone that really had the power to make something powerful and great, but was a nut on top of it. And I think that...
Well, was he really an evil mastermind, or was he an MK Ultra mind control subject forced against his will to exact this
again, Bruce, if you want to go that angle, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, all of his followers were MK Ultra. So obviously he did have something, whether it was charisma, whether it was intelligence, whether it was just, being able to orate a speech. He had something that proved above his followers, and that was why he was able to carry out his mission, if we're going to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I think that, Jones is really underrated in the fact that he was of ultra intelligence. I think that where he went wrong was he believed, I truly believe this. At a certain point, he thought he truly was God because his existence early on was so bleak that he didn't believe in God. But he liked the fact of God because it gave him power. And he preached God because God gave him power. So at a certain point, he became God. And that was the ultimate power.
In 1949, Jones married Marceline Baldwin, a nurse, and the couple moved to Bloomington, Indiana. She later died with him in Jonestown. He attended Indiana University, Bloomington, where a speech by Eleanor Roosevelt about the plight of African Americans impressed him. In 1951, Jones moved to Indianapolis, where he attended night school at Butler University, earning a degree in secondary education in 1961, 10 years after enrolling. So, how do we reconcile his early graduation with honors to the fact that it took him 10 years? Well, it was night school, so I guess there wasn't a big course load. But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, some people allege that his whole association and plight with that of the poor African American class, that was all a farce. That was all a smokescreen to gain political clout. What do you think about that?
Any thoughts, Maxwell?
Something about political clout.
I personally think, Bruce. Yeah, I personally think, Bruce, that it was twofold. I think that Jones was addicted. I mean, there are many serial killers. And we're not just talking about, the big ones. We're talking about the little ones. The ones that the media covers for 20 minutes and then forgets. There are many serial killers out there that are drawn to the ideals of the power of killing helpless early on with animals and so on and so forth. Whether it's their siblings that are helpless, whether it's animals, whether it's their own parents. There are many cases. Look at Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden had an axe. She gave her mother 40 whacks. When she was done, she gave her father 41. There are many individuals out there that are drawn to the power of control over the individual. I would say that Jones, I think, was twofold. I think there is a scope within Jim Jones where he wanted to be the guy that fixed it for you. I think there's an aspect of Jones wanted to be the Martin Luther King. He wanted to be the person. Jones was white as snow. His family before the adoption of multiple, I mean, Jones is said to have a rainbow family, but within his own scope, within what he could produce himself on Earth with his own seed, was white. I don't think that mattered to him for a couple of reasons. I think that he empathized with blacks because he empathized with being on the other side of the track. I think he empathized with the scrutiny that occurs when you're of a downtrodden state. And if you flash back to his period of living, this was very common for them. There were blacks that were denied an education in his era. There were blacks that were persecuted just for being black in his era. There were blacks that did nothing wrong but were nailed to a cross in his era. So I think that he was able to assimilate into that particular culture, not because he was black, I mean, he was white as snow, but because he understood the basic principles that there should be a better living for the people that move the world along. And if we look at the scope of America and we look at the scope of the world, it's the ones that are impoverished that actually push history forward. So he was able to grasp that and move forward. I would say that where it became dark was the fact that Jones was truly addicted to power. And he liked the ability to control his followers. And he liked the ability to control his world. And as he had followers, his world grew to encompass his followers. So at a certain point, I mean, flash forward to Guyana, he had his own world with his own subjects. So he was able to dictate to them the way that the world worked because there was no world outside of Jonestown.
My question was very, very specific into the racial issue. But anyway, so in 1951, Jones began attending gatherings of the Communist Party USA in Indianapolis. He became flustered with harassment during the McCarthy hearings, particularly regarding an event he attended with his mother, focusing on Paul Robeson, after which she was harassed by the FBI in front of her coworkers for attending. He also became frustrated with ostracism of open communists in the United States, especially during the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. This frustration, among other things, provoked a seminal moment for Jones in which he asked himself, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? The thought was infiltrate the church. Jones was surprised when a Methodist district superintendent helped him get a start in the church, even though he knew Jones to be a communist. Jones had not met him through the Communist Party. In 1952, he became a student pastor at the Somerset Southside Methodist Church, but later claimed he left that church because its leaders barred him from integrating blacks into the congregation. Around this time, Jones witnessed a faith healing service at a Seventh-day Baptist church. He observed it attracted people and their money and concluded with financial resources from such healings, he could help accomplish his social goals. Jones organized a mammoth religious convention to take place on June 11th through June 15th, 1956, in a cavernous Indianapolis hall called Cadle Tabernacle. To draw the crowds, Jones needed a religious headliner, and so he arranged to share the pulpit with Reverend William M. Branham, a healing evangelist and religious author who at the time was highly revered as Oral Roberts.
Who was also a mentor.
Following the convention, Jones was able to launch his own church, which changed names until it became the People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel. The People's Temple was initially launched as an interracial mission.
I mean, and you have to understand, Bruce, this was in a time where there were colored restrooms. I mean, Jones can be cast into the darkness as someone that killed 1,000 people, and he did. I mean, whether or not he actually was the one that injected the poison, but he was the first person to adopt a black child in the state of Indiana in America's history. That, I mean, there were signs that he was for good.
Well,
I mean, again, this leads into the cult mentality. Like, is my leader bad? Well, no, because he did this, and they were good.
I'm going to keep referring back to why did he do that? Did he do that for show to gain power and influence versus he believed it truly was the right thing to do. See, with
To
someone,
this day, his Jim Jones Jr., who is his black son, holds a certain credence for Jim Jones, whether or not that's brainwash or
well, I'm
whether or
not
not
sure.
that's
Well, I'm not saying in any way that Jones mistreated him. I'm saying the reason for the choice to adopt might have been a political motion. Not that he didn't care about the kid, but just that the primary motivation was as a political gesture to gain power and influence over people. Does that, if it's all words, if it's all talk, I mean, he might be a good talker, but the action of adopting.
But I mean, Bruce, that's what makes cults intimate. And I'm not trying to go off on a tangent here, but like, just hear me out. That's what makes cults intimate. That's why when people say to you, anyone can join a cult, and then they look at you and they're just like, ha, 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 and then they go to White Castle and they get the 10-pack. The fact is that the reality is that whether or not you believe that anyone can or cannot join a cult, fact is that he saved this kid, and regardless of whether or not he had ill intention or whether it was politically motivated, we'll never really know. I mean, only his son will know.
I don't think his son would know either, because if, for all effects and purposes, I mean, Jones couldn't really, it's not like he could beat the kid and get away with it. Like, if this was a well orchestrated political move, of course he would have to treat him well, so the kid would never know.
But what touches upon all of us, and this is why culture is so pervasive, is that we've all been a part of that move. That's what makes it so persuasive, is that we've all gone there and done that. It's just Jones brought it to the next level. And not everyone that's joining a cult is able to see that. That's the ideals of a cult, is that, we all want to do good. No one, I mean, when you hear these people that have been re-educated or they've left a cult or whatever, they all talk about, like, like no one, like everyone wants to, do better and blah, 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 and like no one wants to join a cult. The fact is that no one really wants to believe what's really happening behind closed doors. And it's ironic because we all have that. I mean, if anyone of your viewers has ever seen the movie Crash, that is a perfect example of a cult. Because
I haven't seen it.
well, I mean, you should watch it. I mean, and if any viewers have seen
Maxwell,
that, they should watch it.
Have you seen that,
Because
No, I haven't
there's
seen Crash.
you've never seen the movie Crash?
It's just cults. What is it?
Well, I mean, it's not about cults. It's actually nothing to do with cults, and it has to do with actors and actresses that I don't have that much respect for. But that said, the aspect of the picture points to what happens out in the open is not what happens behind closed doors. And that is something that's very prevalent in cults. And that's why these red flags are not red flags. They're brown flags or white flags or red flags. Like they don't necessarily register as, hey, I'm involved in a cult, I should get out of this. They're something that, when you join a movement like that and you see that and you're part of it.
We have to stay focused, JR. This is on Jim Jones' origins, not why.
Well, I'm just saying that, like, he adopted the first African American in Indiana. That, to a lot of African Americans who were impoverished and were jaded in Indiana, that caused them to want to become involved with Jim Jones.
And obviously, Jim Jones knew that would happen.
But not necessarily just in Indiana, but across the country.
Well, yeah. So the Rainbow family you speak of, Jim and Marcelyn Jones, adopted several children of at least partially non-Caucasian ancestry.
Approximately 15.
He referred to the household as his Rainbow family and stated, "Integration is a more personal thing with me now. It's a question of my son's future." And also portrayed the temple overall as a rainbow family. The couple adopted 3 children of Korean American ancestry, Lou, Suzanne, and Stephanie. Jones had been encouraging temple members to adopt orphans from war-ravaged Korea. He also has been long critical of U.S. opposition to communist leader Kim Il-sung's 1950 invasion of South Korea, calling it the War of Liberation and stating that the South is a living example of all that socialism in the North has overcome.
And he gave them power.
It's an interesting viewpoint. In 1954,
well, he gave them power. I mean, like Lou Jones was the actual architect of the security force that enforced Jonestown. So he gave people that were adopted as babies having nothing and being from Korean families as having everything. And ultimately in Jonestown, they had the ultimate power over the destruction of Jonestown. Just saying.
In 1954, he and his wife also adopted Agnes Jones, who was partly of Native American descent. Suzanne Jones was adopted at the age of 6 in 1959. In June 1959, the couple had their only biological child, Stephen Gandhi Jones. 2 years later, in 1961, the Joneses became the first white couple in Indiana to adopt a black child, James Warren Jones Jr. The couple also adopted another son who was white named Tim. Tim Jones, whose birth mother was a member of the People's Temple, was originally named Timothy Glenn Tupper.
And keep in mind, the Tuppers were high-end in Jonestown. The Tuppers were considered a affluent family in Jonestown and in People's Temple in general because of the fact that that child was associated with Jim Jones.
In 1960, Indianapolis Mayor Charles Boswell appointed Jones director of the Human Rights Commission. Jones ignored Boswell's advice to keep a low profile, finding new outlets for his views on local radio and television programs. When the mayor and other commissioners asked Jones to curtail his public actions, he resisted and was widely cheered at a meeting at the NAACP and Urban League when he yelled for his audience to become more militant and then climaxed with, "Let my people go." Isn't that a little cliche?
Well, I mean, that's a little, Ben-Hur, if you ask me. I mean, that's what Carlton Heston screamed. But, I mean, that said, it's part of Jones. I mean, Jones, let's look at the Doors. I mean, he disappeared into France and supposedly died, but, he's still cited every couple of years. I mean, let's look at Jim Morrison. The FCC told him, don't say, girl, we're going to get much higher. He did. And the crowd reacted. And as a result, he's forever immortalized. Jones understood the fact that if you go above the norm and if you buck the system, people will react. He did that. So he was able to gain the popularity within the young people, which you have to understand represented the body of People's Temple. There were three main bodies of People's Temple. There was the young people, the middle of the road people, and the old people. The old people financed People's Temple. In the end, they were receiving Social Security checks to the tune of, millions of dollars per month. The young people represented the force of People's Temple. The middle of the road people, the people that supposedly were in control and actually chose to drink the poison, quote unquote, they were actually the smallest proportion. So, over 40% of people of Jonestown were under the age of 35 or under the age of 30.
That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Anyway,
well, what I'm talking about is that he was able to capitalize on the youth vision, and in the youth vision, that is what you're talking about, because it was at that era, it was about resistance within the government.
Okay. During this time, Jones also helped to racially integrate churches, restaurants, the telephone company, the police department, a theater, an amusement park, and the Methodist hospital. After swastikas were painted on the homes of two African-American families, Jones personally walked the neighborhood, comforting local black people and counseling white families not to move in order to prevent white flight. Jones set up stings to catch restaurants refusing to serve black customers and wrote to American Nazi leaders and then passed their responses to the media. When Jones was accidentally placed in the black ward of a hospital after a collapse in 1961, he refused to be moved. He began to make the beds and empty the bedpans of black patients. Political pressures resulted from Jones's actions caused hospital officials to desegregate the wards. Jones received considerable criticism in Indiana for his integrationist views. White-owned businesses and locals were critical of him. A swastika was placed on the temple. A stick of dynamite was left in a temple coal pile, and a dead cat was thrown at Jones's house after a threatening phone call. Other incidents occurred, although some suspect that Jones himself may have been involved in at least some of them. Can you speak to that? Do you think he orchestrated a lot of the so-called animosity against him to boost his support even further?
I mean, any thoughts, Maxwell?
No, I'm good.
All right, well, I do. I mean, yes, I do. I think that, like Jones was about, Jones liked the raw. I mean, there's people that like horror movies. There's people that like, like the typical horror movie. And then there's the people that like the raw. Jones was about the raw. And yes, I do. I think he was actively involved in the perception of his own. I think he liked the fact that he was a badass. I don't think that, like, I mean, we talk about Sean Penn punching at a reporter. I don't think that was good enough for Jones. Jones liked to be a badass his own field.
Do you think Jones had a split personality?
I think that Jones was multifaceted. I wouldn't necessarily say that he had a multiple personality. I would say that he liked the idea that he was gripping. Because, again, this points to his own, in the end. I mean, everything that you're saying, if you look at the Jonestown massacre within the past 4 hours, which is what the only thing the media portrays, and then you look at like his history, it was all Jones. I mean, that's what he was. That's who he did. That was what he was all about. He liked the shock value, and I think that carried from the beginning to the end. The fact that dead cats were left out. I mean, Jones was noted for killing a cat and then giving it a burial.
That's the first thing I thought of when I read that the dead cat was thrown.
I mean, and again, the fact that like there was a dead cat in front of his house. I mean, Jimmy was known for killing cats and then giving them burials. So let me ask you a question. I mean, in your article, does it state that Jones gave that cat a burial?
Wait, what was that?
I mean, let me ask you a question. For the cat that was left outside Jim Jones' door in retaliation, was that cat given a burial?
Oh, I don't see that information here.
Right, but I mean, again, like he was known for killing cats to give them burials, so it wasn't above and beyond Jones to do that to gain empathy, or not even empathy, but I think power over the fact that his movement mattered.
It's tough to really dissect whether Jones was just this completely evil mastermind, or if he believed in his communist cause and the betterment of and mankind, while also being.
I think it was both, Bruce. I think it was both. I think that's what the problem is for a lot of people, is that I mean, when you said, does he have a split personality, I think there was a part of Jones that really wanted it to be that movement. I think there was a part of him that really envied Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers. I think there was a part of him, Malcolm X. I think there's a part of him that really envied that. But there's also this dark side where he was sick enough to perpetuate that on his own terms.
The other thing I wanted to talk about is the communist ideology that he kind of, I don't want to say got roped into, but was exposed to and then chose to follow, basically. What do you think about that, and how that connects to MK Ultra and the U.S. government? Was this a case of him not necessarily being groomed, but being chosen after the fact when he already had communist ideology?
I think Jones was a communist in that he wanted the poor, untrodden people to have all. I think that that's something that spans beyond the scope of People's Temple. I think that spans beyond the scope of, who he was, being, someone that craved attention. I think that was a basic feeling that he felt as someone that was born on the other side of the tracks. I will say that he used that to his advantage. So, I mean, to say it wasn't a manipulative tactic, I would classify Jones as someone that was a scared little kid that wanted the world to be better but didn't know how, but felt that he was empowered because he had the ability to control people based on his ability to manipulate. And that's what drove him forward. And the more and more he manipulated and the more and more he was able to control, the less and less it became about the purpose of the cause and more about his own personal problems and his own personal ego.
Do you think if the MK Ultra CIA operation came afterwards, do you think, like, is it a chicken or the egg situation where he was kind of chosen by the CIA and MK Ultra, or did it happen the other way around?
Well, he was definitely chosen. I think that, based on his flock, based on his principles, it's not about him being politically successful at that time. Just, you also have to understand that, like, again, this all started in Redwood Valley. After he moved from Indiana to Redwood, that's where the communal situation began to occur. That's where the experimentation actually started to exist. Whether or not Temple members acknowledge that, that's because they were the test bed. There was still good food. There was still, love. There was still joy. There was still being able to communicate with one's family. But this was the test bed for Guyana. I think
Okay,
at that
so let's
particular point in time,
what a lot of
MK Ultra was at its prime. I mean, you have to look at the years. MK Ultra was at its peak at that point in time and was actually being exposed. So the movement from governmental organization to privatary organization was very real. So I can't acknowledge or dispute that.
So, what a lot of people don't know is that Jim Jones actually traveled to Brazil after a 1961 Temple speech about a nuclear apocalypse and a January 62 Esquire magazine article. We talked about this before and why he moved to California. That article also listed Belo Horizonte, Brazil, as a safe place in a nuclear war. Jones traveled with his family to the city with the idea of setting up a new temple location. On his way to Brazil, Jones made his first trip to Guyana, then a British colony. After arriving in Belo Horizonte, the Joneses rented a modest 3-bedroom home. Jones studied the local economy and receptiveness of racial minorities to his message, although language remained a barrier. He also explored local Brazilian syncretic religions. Jones was careful not to portray himself as a communist in a foreign territory and spoke of an apostolic communal lifestyle rather than of Castro or Marx. Ultimately, the lack of resources in the locale led the Joneses to move to Rio de Janeiro in mid-1963. There, they worked with the poor in Rio's slums. Jones became plagued by guilt for leaving behind the Indiana civil rights struggle and possibly losing what he had tried to build there. When Jones's associate preachers in Indiana told him that the temple was about to collapse without him, he returned. And we'll deal with a lot of those specific.
Yeah, I mean, and also you have to also understand. I mean, like you spoke about Brazil, that's definitely a case. A lot of people don't know he also relocated to Hawaii, and based on the time scale, Hawaii had just recently been acquired within 10 years by the United States. So that was also a key point. And I really feel, Bruce, I mean, personally, that should be a dedicated podcast because, like his interactions with volatile governments rings true before Guyana ever existed. And that's never even, I mean, we don't even talk about that in modern documentaries. That's just something that.
Before I talked to you about it, I had no idea he had previously even visited Guyana and Brazil and all these other locations.
Oh yeah.
And
Multiple times.
Some people point to CIA involvement happening at this time when he started going to all these different countries, because that's kind of that's you're going into CIA territory once you're looking at international conspiracy.
Well, I mean, and then there's actual evidence that he actually attended CIA bases in which there's actually passport stamps and, envelopes from his family. I mean, from, his own children, bearing the resonant signals.
So what the hell was he doing in all these places if it wasn't a simple preacher just coming out to help with a social cause? Like, what was going on?
Well, I mean, like we're going with the origins, Bruce. We're not talking about, we're not talking about the actual the nuts and bolts of the CIA involvement here.
Oh,
But
you're gonna leave all our listeners hanging without giving us
well, I mean, like that's I mean, like I'm not leaving them hanging. I'm just saying, like, we're talking about origins. We're not talking about the nuts and bolts of why he moved where and why.
Okay, so we went over his background, where he came from, idiosyncrasies, the strangeness, the possible political motivations of all his actions, including adoptions. What do you think, Maxwell? Like, was this a perfect storm recipe for what happened in Guyana, or was it just a kind of unfortunate series of events that culminated in a great tragedy? Maxwell?
Well, I don't. It didn't just happen, but
Maxwell's
I don't know. I think
Maxwell's contributions to this podcast are many. It didn't just happen. That should be on your new mug, by the way, too.
By the way, Bruce, where the fuck is my T-shirt?
The merchandise is coming along. It's coming.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's Christmas. Oh, I'm sorry, Bruce. That's fast.
Let Maxwell finish. Why are you interrupting?
I don't know. I think you guys. I heard some MK Ultra stuff. So I don't know. You guys think it's the whole MK Ultra experiment, or like he was an MK Ultra experiment? And,
if he was or he wasn't, at what point did that become involved? Because what's your take on this whole timeline of Jim Jones and his origins?
I missed a lot of details, so I can't really say.
You mean all of them?
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, JR, any closing thoughts on origins? Hopefully our listeners kind of understand where Jim Jones came from and the situation surrounding his rise to power and influence.
Well, I mean, Bruce, there will definitely be like a part 2 because we never really described his marriage or how that came to be a part of where he, went from being a Christian preacher, that was married and faithful to being a commune leader where effectively he believed in polygamy. But that said, I will say that Jones rolled not only with the times, but Jones was who you wanted him to be. And I've said that in multiple podcasts. I'm not going to reiterate that. But he was what you wanted him to be. And as his fellowship grew, he became someone that was larger than life. And again, it stoked his ego. I mean, we didn't really touch on the fact that Jones's mother was a very curt woman who was, I think you have to understand that Jones was raised in an era where women didn't necessarily work unless they had to. The fact that Jones's father was disabled, even though he could have had war hero written on him, we're not going to ever know that because, again, his documents were burned in a fire. His mother was very critical over his father, but she said, she stood by him. And I think that reigns true to Jones's movement. Jones had a lot of opportunities with his movement where he had the power, he had the control, he had the political influence where he could have said, you know what, fuck you. And he could have dejected his own political movement and moved forward politically or up the rungs. I mean, you're talking about someone that had private audiences with the president, had private audiences with not only the president, but his wife, Rosalind Carter. You're talking about somebody that got, Charles Moscone elected. He got him elected. That's a fact. That's not, the fact that his members showed up and elected him, that's a fact. He had audiences with Harvey Milk. I mean, these are people that are, they're household names. I mean, yeah. Jones was, part of a special breed of people that, he was able to assimilate himself within a grouping. I think that at a certain point, the three key things that we could learn about Jim Jones within his origin was he was very charismatic, he was extremely intelligent, he was very mentally ill. And I think that whether or not if you believe in the conspiracy, he was the prime target for CIA, he was the prime target for government influence. If you don't believe that, he was just a sick individual who was able to control a flock and they were able to die. I think in further podcasts we'll expound to where you'll understand, or at least you'll gain a picture for your own understanding as to where he sits within that spectrum. But for now, being episode 3, we'll just say that he's the type of person that he had the ability to be both, but he chose one path. And that's, ultimately, it shaped America.
Maxwell, closing thoughts?
Yeah, nothing. I got nothing.
Maxwell Army. All right, well, we hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MindShock podcast, MindShock True Crime in the Jonestown series. If you like our podcast, of course, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you're subbed to the channel. Hit the bell for notifications. If you like the podcast, hit the like button. Leave any thoughts, questions, comments, or suggestions, and we will get to them. And make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Make sure you like our Facebook page, and you can check us out on Twitter, Reddit, and Patreon as well. This is Bruce McGuire signing off.
And Maxwell Powers.
And JR tapping out.
Until next time.